Hey everybody, this is Chapter 5 of Michael Heinrich's The Science of Value. Chapter 5 is the first chapter of Part 3 of the book, which is titled The Ambivalence of the Fundamental Categories of the Critique of Political Economy. Chapter 5 itself is titled The Architecture of the Critique of Political Economy. Heading 1, and the sections of the book are Section 1, Interpretation of Marxian Dialectics, Marx and Hegel. 2. Dialectical exposition as a form of scientific substantiation. 3. The six-book plan and the distinction between, quote, capital in general and the, quote, competition of many capitals, end quote. Section 4. The dissolution of, quote, capital in general. And Chapter 5. The structure of capital. Or Section 5. The structure of capital. Excuse me. So here we go. Chapter 5. The Architectonics of the Critique of Political Economy. In 1849, Marx was expelled first from Prussia and then from Paris, prompting him to relocate his family to London, where he would remain for the rest of his life. As the autobiographical sketch in the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859 reveals, the year 1850 also marked a turning point in Marx's scholarly work. Faced with a vast amount of material available to him at the British Museum, he decided to start his economic studies, quote, all over again from the beginning, end quote. These studies initially resulted in a series of notebooks containing excerpts that reflect his engagement with virtually all the major economists as well as many lesser-known ones. Marx was only able to tackle the plan, which he had repeatedly postponed, of writing an economics work of his own starting in 1857. Within just a few months, he produced the notebooks that were first published in Moscow between 1939 and 1941 under the title Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Rohentwurf, Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, Rough Draft. This manuscript was not intended for immediate publication. However, Marx planned to use it as the basis for a comprehensive treatment of bourgeois economics, structured into 6 books. Capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, and the world market. The project was launched with the publication of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Part 1, in 1859, although his work contained only 2 chapters, dealing with the commodity and money. A surviving fragment of an earlier draft of this text also includes the beginning of a 3rd chapter on capital. It was first published in 1941 alongside the Grundrisse, under the title Urtext zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Original Text for the Critique of Political Economy. Originally conceived as a continuation of the first facile, the manuscript, produced between 1861 and 1863, comprising approximately 2,400 printed pages, stands as Marx's most extensive manuscript. Marx himself did not publish this manuscript either. Kautsky published only the sections dealing with theories of surplus value, which accounted for about half of the text, The complete text appeared between 1976 and 1982 in the Mega 2, under the title Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, manuscript 1861 to 1863, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, manuscript 1861 to 63. While working on this manuscript, Marx decided to issue the continuation of the, quote, first facile, end quote, published in 1859 as an independent work titled Capital, which is intended to comprise 3 books: The Production Process of Capital, The Circulation Process of Capital, and the Forms of the Process as a whole. Manuscripts for all 3 books were produced between 1863 and 1865. Of the manuscript for the first book, only the concluding chapter, Results of the Immediate Process of Production, which had been omitted from the published version and first appeared in print in 1933, has survived. The manuscripts of the second and third books, written in 1864 to 65, were published for the first time in 1988 and 1994 in the Mega. End footnote. I don't know why I said end footnote. I was just reading a bunch of footnotes. I think that's why I said that. But sorry. Finally, in 1867, the first volume of Capital appeared. A second edition followed in 1872, differing significantly from the first, particularly in the section analyzing the form of value. a manuscript in which Marx carried out these revisions and set down conceptual reflections that he did not include in the published text, was first published in 1988 in the Mega 2, under the editorial title Additions and Alterations to the First Volume of Capital. Between 1872 and 1876, a French translation appeared, initially in several installments and later as a book, which contained further changes compared to the second edition, particularly in the section on the accumulation of capital. The third and fourth editions of the first volume were prepared by Engels after Marx's death. In doing so, Engels incorporated some of the changes Marx had made for the French edition, but not others. Consequently, the resulting text was no longer edited by Marx himself. The second and third volumes of Capital were published by Engels only after Marx's death. For the third volume, as published in Marx Engels Werke 25, Engels relied primarily on the manuscript written in 1864 to 65, as well as several shorter texts produced later that had not previously been published. For the second volume, Marx Engels Werke 24, as his preface indicates, Engels did not use the manuscript from 1864, but rather 7 previously unpublished manuscripts from the 1860s and 1870s. Even this brief outline of the publication history of Capital makes 2 facts clear. 1. All 3 volumes of Capital, in the form that has circulated worldwide for over a century and been published in the Marx Engels Werke, exist not in versions edited by Marx, but in versions edited by Engels. 2. The chronological order in which the manuscripts were produced does not correspond to the sequence of the volumes. The oldest is the main manuscript for Volume 3, followed by the various drafts for Volume 1, and finally the manuscripts for Volume 2, late 1860s to late 1870s. It follows from this second point that the manuscript for Book 3 cannot be regarded as the capstone of the critique of political economy, since it could not yet take into account the further development of the analysis presented in the first 2 books. The frequent revisions demonstrate just how much Marx's analysis was still in flux. This point is particularly relevant regarding the theory of credit and the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit. In these areas, the third volume does not represent the final word. The first point also presents difficulties. While Engels' editing of the text for the first volume posed relatively few problems, a comparison of the original manuscript for the third volume, published for the first time in the Mega, with the edition prepared by Engels revealed a multitude of unmarked textual alterations. Although Engels deserves credit for transforming Marx's manuscript into a readable text, Engels achieved this not merely through stylistic corrections, but through a significant number of interventions that altered the content. Consequently, any in-depth study of the third volume in the future will have to refer to Marx's original manuscript rather than Engels' edition. All the economic writings produced from 1857 onwards presupposed the break with a theoretical field of political economy, a break definitively accomplished with the introduction and discussed in the final chapter. In this respect, they can be distinguished as a unified project, a, quote, critique of political economy, from the anthropologically grounded, quote, critique of national economy of the early 1840s. However, the overview of the text produced since 1857 should have made clear the difficulties facing any interpretation of the critique of political economy project. Of the writings listed, Marx himself published only 2, a contribution to the critique of political economy, Part 1, and the first volume of Capital, in both its first and second editions. The vast majority of the surviving text consist of manuscripts and excerpts at varying stages of elaboration, a significant number of which have never been published. Finally, these individual manuscripts were produced over a period of more than 20 years. They contain a wealth of changes and developments, making it impossible to simply aggregate the various texts into a single cohesive body of work whose parts seamlessly complement one another. Between 1859 and 1867, not only did the understanding of specific categories shift, though it is not immediately obvious that every change represented an improvement, but the overall architecture of the critique of political economy also underwent transformation. Yet, changes in the structure of presentation cannot simply be reduced to didactic considerations. As the discussion of the quote, dialectical method of presentation, sections 1 and 2 aims to demonstrate, the organization of the exposition was by no means arbitrary for Marx, rather the structure itself conveys specific information. When drawing upon various texts for interpretation, one must carefully examine not only changes in the understanding of individual categories, but also shifts in the overall structure of presentation. Sections 3 to 5, and consequently in the theoretical location where a given category is addressed. One, interpretations of Marxian dialectics. New section. Marx and Hegel. Marx later described the form of presentation which was merely sketched out in the 1857 introduction as, quote, dialectical. In the literature, whether critical or sympathetic to Marx, quote, dialectical is frequently used to characterize his entire approach, and many authors referencing Marx employ the term, quote, dialectics in a virtually inflationary manner without clarifying what they mean by it. Most often, the label, quote, dialectic seems intended to convey that the subject matter involves, quote, contradictory developments and complex interactions between various elements. Thus, the term is applied not merely to a specific scientific mode of presentation, but also to characterize the course of actual processes as, quote, dialectical. Such an understanding of dialectics finds its strongest basis in the work of Engels, although a few, albeit rather incidental remarks pointing in this direction can also be found in Marx. In contrast, Engels attempted to develop a systematic conception of materialist real dialectics in his Anti-Düring and Dialectics of Nature. Engels defines dialectics as, quote, the science of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society, and thought, end quote. Engels distinguishes, quote, in the main, end quote, three, quote, laws of dialectics, end quote. Quote, the law of transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, the law of the interpenetration of opposites, the law of the negation, end quote. Engels. In this conception, dialectics turns into ontology, that is, into a general theory of being, thereby running the risk of either hypostatizing results abstracted from a specific historical stage of the natural and social sciences into, quote, general laws of motion, end quote, or losing itself in generalities that fit any content, but for that very reason lack any explanatory power. The concern here, however, is not with, quote, dialectics in a broad sense, nor with whether such an ontology might be justified or whether it conflicts with Marxian conceptions. Rather, the focus is solely on what can be said about, quote, dialectical exposition, end quote, as a method of scientific substantiation, and even this not exhaustively, but only insofar as it is relevant to the argument that follows. In his exchange with Engels, Marx emphasized that a specific sequence of exposition had to be adhered to, otherwise, quote, the whole dialectical method of development would be ruined, end quote. Letter of June 27, 1867. Yet Marx never commented at length on what actually constitutes this dialectical method of development or on the nature of dialectical substantiations. By contrast, the number of interpreters of this method has since become legion. Even within the camp of analytic philosophy of science, dialectics is no longer simply dismissed as unscientific ideology, as was the case with Popper in 1940 or Becker in 1972 A and B. Thus, Hellberger endeavored to show that essential parts of Marx's work are, quote, empirical, analytical, end quote, in nature. While C. Hellberger, 1974, while Simon Scheffer, 1974 and 1977, maintained the view that when correctly understood, Marxian dialectics ultimately leads to Popperian falsificationism. The most detailed attempt at interpretation is that of Steinfort. He views the dialectical exposition in Marx's Capital as an analysis of the compatibility of seemingly contradictory properties of an object of study, concluding that this exposition is consistent with the criteria of the analytical theory of science. However, all these attempts at interpretation presuppose from the outset that Marxian dialectics does not provide a specific context of justification for scientific statements. It's precisely this question that is to be discussed here. A Marxist school of interpretation that was dominant for a long time views the dialectical development of categories as an abstract reflection of actual historical development. As early as 1887, Kautsky wrote in his popular outline of Capital the work was, quote, essentially historical in nature, end quote. And Lenin held the view that in Capital, Marx traces the development of capitalism from, quote, simple commodity production to, quote, large-scale production, end quote. The idea that Marxian dialectics is characterized by a unity of logical, conceptual, and historical analysis is also maintained in many more recent works, parenthesis, Zelenyi, 1962, Reichelt, 1970, and Mandel, 1972. Although the significance attributed to this unity varies, it is central to the work of Holtzkamp, who also sought to provide a detailed exposition of the concept. Holtzkamp distinguishes between the actual history of the emergence of bourgeois society and the stages of that emergence necessitated by its development. The, quote, logical development of the categories represents nothing other than this sequence of stages. Marx's, quote, logical historical method, end quote, grasps, quote, the essence of the object from the developmental logic of its coming into being, end quote. Holtzkamp. Whether this interpretation of Marx's method is accurate can only be determined by examining the text of Capital itself. In any case, it contradicts Marx's own stated understanding. He had already noted in the Grundrisse, quote, the conditions and presuppositions of the becoming, of the emergence of capital, presuppose precisely that it does not yet exist, but is only coming into being. They therefore vanish with actual capital, with the capital that, proceeding from its own reality, posits the conditions of its realization. Okay. Marx. And that's kind of like, if you listen to the book by, this is a whole thing within the history of reception of Marx, is the nature of the, historico-logical method and disputing it. And I would say that by the best scholars in the game, it has been successfully defeated as an interpretation of the opening opening chapter, or the whole structure of Marx's Capital. That's kind of a very important thing, right? The idea of capital, and I think this is one of the big influences of Althusser just in general on the thing, is it kind of he rejects a historical interpretation of Marx's Capital. How detailed he gets into the actual kind of analysis of the critique of political economy. He's a philosopher, so he's kind of talking about it on a very abstract level, but he rejects what historicist reading of Capital. And historicist, when I think of historicist, I think of the idea of capitalism being a historically specific mode of production that is not absolute, right? That it's not natural in the sense of eternal. But in the Althusserian reading, historicist seems to me, at least, to mean the idea that capital constitutes some kind of the analysis present in Marx's Capital is some kind of chronology of a historical work. Seems way more the common interpretation, and I think the correct interpretation is that it's about a system. It's about the workings of a system, not the development of a system, if that makes sense. So I think the word that Althusser uses, or at least how other people working from Althusser kind of goes it's what it's describing is something synchronic as opposed to diachronic, right? Synchronic meaning organic and kind of meaning that the elements of the analysis are mutually presupposing, right? So capital within a capitalist society, within a capitalist mode of production, capital, money, commodity, and all those kinds of various categories that you read about in the Critique of Political Economy are mutually presupposing and not kind of and not what's the word? historically derived from each other. Anyway, check out the piece I have on here by Althusser, The Object of Capital, but also check out especially Jan Hoff and Ingo Elba's work on this channel. Anyway, Marx is not simply making a chronological classification here. So let me reread the last quote that I started before I start yammering on. Quote, the conditions and presuppositions of the becoming of the emergence of capital presuppose precisely that it does not yet exist but is only coming into being. They therefore vanish with actual capital, with the capital that, proceeding from its own reality, posits the conditions of its realization, quote, Marx Grundrisse. Marx is not simply making a chronological classification here. Rather, he distinguishes between two different theoretical objects, the historical genesis of capital, which depends on external conditions, and capital as a fully formed entity, which reproduces its own presuppositions. However, understanding the second object does not presuppose an understanding of the first. Thus, the introduction already stated, quote, it would therefore be unfeasible and wrong to let the economic categories follow one another in the sequence in which they were historically decisive. Rather, their order is determined by the relation they bear to one another in modern bourgeois society. End quote. Marx. In fact, the reverse is true. Understanding what has developed historically opens the way to understanding what is less developed, a point Marx emphasized repeatedly, ultimately leading him to the pointed formulation, quote, human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape, end quote. So that kind of, I think maybe and that's Marx, but the kind of, in my view at least, kind of translates capitalism. This means that understanding the transition from a non-capitalist mode of production to a capitalist mode of production presupposes knowledge of what the capitalist mode of production is in order to distinguish it from what led to it, right? So, yeah, and obviously, and that's kind of I feel like that actually talking about how any particular mode of how the capitalism comes to be in any particular place is very much an empirical question. That's a question for, in my view, that's a question for a historian, as opposed to someone who's working on the high theoretical altitude of the critique of political economy. So, even though there's obviously similarities, right? You couldn't say capitalism coming to parts of southern England is the same. Capitalism coming to be there is the same as the way capitalism came to contemporary China. That's something that's beyond the scope of a theoretical analysis of the necessary features of a capitalist mode of production. Anyway, the fact that the historicizing interpretation of Marx's exposition, viewing it as a unity of historical and conceptual logical development, could become so popular is due in no small part to a statement made by Engels in his review of a contribution to the critique of political economy. He writes that the logical method of treatment is, quote, in fact nothing other than the historical method, only stripped of the historical form and of the distracting contingencies, end quote. Engels. As the context makes clear, however, this does not mean that historical development provides the foundation for logical development. Rather, Engels holds that historical development proceeds from simple to complex conditions, and that consequently, within, quote, literary historical development, end quote, economic categories appear, quote, by and large, end quote, in the same sequence as they do in the logical development. It is solely because of his alleged parallel between historical and logical development that it is solely because of this alleged parallel between historical and logical development that Engels concludes the logical treatment is, in essence, a historical one. While the thesis of parallelism is itself highly problematic, it should not be equated with the historicizing interpretation of dialectics. The other interpretive approach of central importance, which may well overlap with a historicizing interpretation, attempts to define the specific nature of Marx's mode of presentation from the perspective of Hegelian philosophy. Various stages of Marx's critique of Hegel, as well as the implicit critique of his own early critique of Hegel, have already been outlined in the third and fourth chapters. Yet Marx's engagement with Hegel was far from over. The fact that Marx continued to grapple with Hegel during the late 1850s and 1860s is evident not only from the well-known letter to Engels, which states, quote, "It was of great service to my method of working that I had, by mere accident, leafed through Hegel's logic again," end quote. Marx, January 16th, 1858. An excerpt from the Shorter Logic, Marx 1860 to 1863, produced between 1860 and 1863, also attests to his ongoing engagement with Hegel. However, even after 1857, Marx did not express himself unequivocally regarding his relationship to Hegel. In the afterword to the second edition of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx described his own dialectical method as the, quote, direct opposite of Hegel's. The latter, he argued, had to be, quote, turned right side up again, end quote, in order to, quote, discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell, end quote. While the talk of, quote, opposite and, quote, turning right side up is admittedly rather obscure in this context, it nonetheless suggests that Hegelian dialectics, however inverted, held a certain significance for Marx's exposition. On the other hand, in the same passage, Marx writes that he had merely, quote, coquetted with Hegelian modes of expression. Despite numerous attempts to reconstruct Marx's understanding of method and his relationship to Hegel based on these abstract remarks, for example, Rude, 1974, and Fulda, 1975, one must surely agree with Althusser at least to the extent that these statements merely indicate Marx's belief that he had clarified his relationship to Hegel, while the remarks themselves are far from actually providing such a clarification. See Althusser 1963 and Althusser 1967. Lenin and Lukács, Lenin in 1914-15 and Lukács 1923, had already attributed key importance to Hegelian logic for understanding Marx's economic theory, and Becker, Bekker, 1940, had attempted to present a systematic account of Marx's understanding of dialectics in relation to Hegel. With the renewed reception of Capital in the late 1960s and 1970s, heavily influenced by an approach to Marx that was oriented more toward philosophy than economic theory, a distinctly, quote, Hegelianizing interpretation of Capital emerged, particularly in the Federal Republic of Germany. Alfred Schmidt held the view that the methodological structure of Capital is grounded in a, quote, second reception of Hegel, end quote, by Marx that took place in the late 1950s. Reichelt conceives of, quote, Marx's theory of value as a materialist deciphering of the Hegelian world spirit, end quote, Reichelt, and sees a, quote, structural commonality, end quote, between the critique of political economy and Hegelian philosophy. Reichelt, 1970. According to Bübner, Marx depicts bourgeois society through a system of contradictions and, quote, the systematic interconnection of these contradictions derives from the speculative method of Hegelian logic, end quote, Bübner. Consequently, Marx's method can only be understood as Botter et al., 1975, put it, by, quote, recourse to Hegel, end quote, leading them to preface their interpretation of Capital with an extensive interpretation of Hegel. The idea underlying these, quote, Hegelo-Marxist interpretations was articulated most clearly by Kroll. Quote, according to Marx, the critique of political economy consists precisely in the application of the categories of Hegelian logic, detached from their metaphysical content, to the categories of political economy, end quote, Kroll. Perhaps the most nuanced attempt at interpretation along these lines is undertaken by Brentel, 1986 and 1989, Chapter 7. And Helmut Brentel is like one of the people. I think he's I think my impression, if I remember it correctly from when I was reading Elba and Hoff, Brentel's reception of Marx is highly esteemed by those people. Is to be highly esteemed in Hoff and Elba's view, and I think he's like the other person besides I think Michael Heinrich is kind of like the one they probably champion the most, and Helmut Brentel and Heinrich. So I'm curious to see what Heinrich has to say about Brentel, whose book I plan on translating. I have their book in the works too. Perhaps the most nuanced attempt at interpretation along these lines was undertaken by Brentel, 1986 and 1989, Chapter 7, who sought to demonstrate that Marx conceived his exposition as a, quote, continuous development of contradictions from commodity to money and capital, unquote. Brentel understands this development of contradictions by analogy with the logic of Hegel's, quote, determinations of reflection, unquote, and ultimately arrives at the following conclusion, quote, Marx's resolution of the contradictions inherent in the opposing characters of labor in bourgeois society largely follows the Hegelian model, and this applies not merely at the level of contradiction structures that can be shown to be formally analogous, but rather with regard to the very subject matter they implicitly share, namely the problem of socialization and mediation in bourgeois society, which Hegel was ultimately able to address only in a philosophically mystifying manner, end quote. Brentel, 1986. After discussing the most important Hegelian Marxist contributions, Behrens and Hofner, who are quite sympathetic to the entire undertaking and defend Hegelian Marxism against its fundamental critics, nevertheless conclude that, despite some progress in the details, quote, the Hegel-Marx relationship remains largely unresolved, end quote. Behrens and Hofner. Since Behrens and Hofner view the term, quote, Hegel-Marxism, end quote, as an inadmissible construct devised by critics, it seems appropriate to clarify my use of this label. It is not intended simply to designate all approaches that inquire into the relationship between Marx and Hegel, but rather those that regard Hegelian argumentative structures as the decisive key to understanding Marx's critique of political economy, on the premise that Marx's argumentation follows these structures in one way or another, and, whether explicitly or implicitly, presupposes that one must first understand Hegel before one can understand Marx. But that's the famous saying from Lenin, no one's understood capital because they don't understand Hegel's logic. What strikes me as problematic about this approach is not merely the claim that Marx, quote, transferred Hegelian categories. An attempt at such application was precisely what Marx had criticized in Lassalle. Above all, however, Hegelian philosophy itself seems hardly to permit such a procedure. For a transfer of Hegelian categories presupposes that the argumentative structures of Hegelian logic can be detached from their speculative content at all. Yet Hegel, who saw his logic as a new historical beginning, had specifically rejected the traditional notion that logic deals with categories of thought that, as mere forms, still require the subsequent addition of content. What do people call it? What's the word? There's a word that people use to describe Hegel's philosophy. Ontologic. So Hegel, when he's doing in his in the science of logic, is not merely saying these are the laws of thought, these are the laws of thinking, these are the innate laws of the universe. And that's also the very strange thing about Hegelian Marxism, right? Is you have to very much distinguish they're not it's not the idea of flipping Hegel's method on its head or something like that. I feel like that presupposes. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a Hegel expert, but I do know enough to know that what Hegel's talking about is not society or something like that. He's talking about the fundamental laws of the cosmos, and the laws of capitalism are are historically specific and very much distinct from the laws of the cosmos. Anyway. Sorry, let me repeat that last sentence. Hegel, who saw his logic as a new historical beginning, had specifically rejected the traditional notion that logic deals with categories of thought that as mere forms still require the subsequent addition of content. Rather, the content of these categories is, quote, logical reason itself, end quote. Hegel therefore emphasizes that his method, quote, is not distinct from its subject matter and content, end quote. This understanding of logic follows from Hegel's critique of Kant, in the latter's investigation of the extent to which forms of thought are capable of cognition. There crept, quote, the misunderstanding of wanting to know before knowing, or, to use the old illustration, of refusing to go into the water until one has learned to swim, end quote. End quote, Hegel. Hegel's point here is that any investigation into the forms of thought inevitably presupposes those very forms, such that within such an investigation, these forms can only refer to themselves. From this he concludes, quote, the forms of thought must be considered in and for themselves. They are the object and the activity of the object itself. They examine themselves and must determine their own limits and reveal their own deficiencies. This then is the activity of thought that will subsequently be considered specifically as dialectic, end quote. Hegel. Hegel's logical categories do not organize some external interchangeable content, rather they always refer only to themselves. At the end of the Science of Logic, Hegel summarizes an understanding of, quote, method, and criticizes the notion that method is merely, quote, the mode of cognition, end quote. Instead, method is the, quote, concept that knows itself and takes itself as the absolute, both subjective and objective as its object, end quote. Hegel. Method, understood in this way, is, quote, the sole and absolute power of reason, and not only that, but also its highest and sole impulse, to find and recognize itself within everything through itself, end quote. Hegel. And precisely this self-referentiality, the concept taking itself as its own object, reason recognizing only itself everywhere, and thus the sublation of the difference between the subject of knowledge and the knowledge itself, is constitutive of the dialectical development within Hegelian logic. Parentheses, see Heinrich 1971, Heinrich 1974, and Kosiba 1979, in parentheses. Marx, however, is always dealing with an external object. His exposition must articulate the connections inherent in this material. Consequently, anything more than a mere, quote, flirtation with Hegelian modes of expression, especially when viewed from the perspective of Hegelian philosophy itself, does not appear to have been possible at the outset. On the other hand, however, this does not mean that Hegelian philosophy played no role whatsoever in Marx's critique of political economy. Rather, the issue is less about adopting specific argumentative structures than about a particular stage in the formulation of the problem, a stage that had first to be derived from Hegelian philosophy. Teunissen's interpretation of Hegel's Science of Logic can be read in this light. Taking as a starting point Marx's well-known characterization of his own undertaking as, quote, once an exposition of the system, bracket, of economic categories, Michael Heinrich, end bracket, and through that exposition a critique of it, end quote. Marx. Teunissen formulates something similar regarding Hegel, quote, Hegelian logic is, according to the methodological idea underlying it, a unity of critique and exposition of metaphysics, end quote. Teunissen. Regardless of the merits of Teunissen's specific interpretation of Hegel, it seems to me that such issues mark the very level at which the question of the relationship between Marx and Hegel can be meaningfully posed. Yet this also reveals that clarifying this question presupposes a substantial understanding of Hegel and Marx. It cannot therefore serve as a prerequisite for an adequate understanding of the critique of political economy. New section, section 2. Dialectical exposition as a form of scientific grounding. In what follows, I do not aim to provide a comprehensive answer to the question of the relationship between Marx and Hegel. I intend only to address the, quote, dialectical specificities of Marx's mode of exposition, insofar as this is necessary for the arguments presented in the subsequent chapters. However, even for this limited scope, the question arises as to which of Marx's texts should serve as the basis, since it is by no means a foregone conclusion that all texts written after 1857 are equally suitable for this purpose. For instance, Güler has argued that the meaning of, quote, dialectical presentation, end quote, in Marx's Capital differs significantly from that in A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. See the next chapter regarding Guler. Meanwhile, Backhaus and Reichout perceive a progressive, quote, popularization at work in the development of the critique of political economy. They point out that Marx not only popularized the analysis of the value form between the first and second editions and excised a number of methodologically important remarks, but also wrote to Engels that the continuation of a contribution to the critique of political economy would be, quote, much more popular and the method much more concealed than in Part 1, end quote. Letter of December 9, 1861. They view this as evidence that a contribution to the critique, and not merely capital, represents a popularized version of the Grundrisse. Consequently, they maintain that an authentic understanding of the method can be derived only from the Grundrisse. The original draft of a contribution to the critique and the short outline of the planned work that Marx sketched in a letter to Engels dated April 12, 1858, parenthesis, Backhaus, Reichout, 1995, Reichout, 1996, Backhaus, 1998, end parenthesis. 2 points here strike me as problematic. First, the, quote, concealment of the method is equated with its alteration or partial abandonment, a conclusion that does not necessarily follow but must instead be examined on a case-by-case basis. Furthermore, focusing on the Grundrisse and the original draft fails to take into account that subsequent developments involved not only popularizations but also refinements. Consequently, relying on the Grundrisse alone can lead one astray. Regarding the various texts of the critique of political economy produced since 1857, neither the notion of a steady ascent toward ever greater perfection, parenthesis, a view cultivated primarily within Marxism-Leninism, end parenthesis, nor the idea of a steady descent into increasing popularization seems appropriate to me. Rather, we are dealing with a complex pattern of ups and downs involving both refinements and popularizations, which may obscure certain insights. The following, quote, minimal account of what, quote, dialectical development, end quote, entails in the critique of political economy attempts, however, to highlight only the most general points that should apply equally to the Grundrisse and to capital. As mentioned in the previous chapter, Marx judges Hegel's dialectical presentation of the, quote, concrete in thought, end quote, to be the product of, quote, the concept thinking and generating itself outside or above intuition and representation, end quote. Marx. In contrast, Marx claims that his own presentation is the result of, quote, processing intuition, representation into concept, quote, processing intuition and representation into concepts, end quote. Thus, both Marx and Hegel are concerned with a conceptual development. The difference is that in the one case, it is the concept, singular, that develops out of itself, independently of all empirical reality, whereas in the other, it involves the interconnection of concepts, plural, that process empirical material without dissolving into mere nominalist abstractions. They constitute the, quote, real universal, discussed earlier. One can speak of conceptual development in Marx's work insofar as he does not simply leave individual concepts standing side by side as independent elements, justified merely by reference to the empirical material from which they were derived, but rather arranges them in a specific order. This order is not external to them, nor does it merely establish an overall connection, but is essential to the determination of the categories themselves, an order that expresses the essential relationships between the categories. Marx regards this mode of presentation as one necessitated by the object itself, developed bourgeois economics. For as holds true for any, quote, organic system, so too in the, quote, fully developed bourgeois system, end quote. Marx. Quote, each economic relation presupposes the other in the bourgeois economic form, and thus each posited element is simultaneously a presupposition, end quote. Marx. However, since the presentation requires a starting point, this reciprocal presupposition must be conceptually broken open. The prerequisite for the exposition is, first of all, the distinction between simple and complex relations. While simple relations do indeed presuppose complex ones, they can initially be fixed in categories that do not presuppose categories expressing more complex relations. Marx highlights this state of affairs when he writes that, quote, in theory, the concept of value precedes that of capital, yet on the other hand, for its full development, It presupposes a mode of production based on capital. End quote. In the simpler category, the quote simple relationship is initially expressed without reference to the more complex relationships. In this respect, this quote simple category always already entails an abstraction. However, the determinations of the simple category cannot fully capture the simple relationship. They are quote deficient. This quote deficiency is necessary at the stage of exposition reached. Since abstraction is made from the relationship of this category to the other categories, it must necessarily appear deficient. The manner in which a category's deficiency manifests itself simultaneously reveals how it can be remedied by means of another category. The first category points beyond itself to the second, which in turn remains deficient as long as the totality of the bourgeois mode of production has not yet been depicted. Thus, the quote dialectical exposition establishes a specific logical connection between the individual categories, the sequence of categories. The quote transition from one category to the next is therefore not merely a matter of didactics, but possesses a specific informational content of its own. Marx often describes the deficiency of a category as a quote opposition or quote contradiction between its various determinations. This way of speaking has sparked numerous debates regarding the relationship between Marxian dialectics and formal logic. Many critics of Marxism, as well as some Marxists, interpreted these quote contradictions as contradictions in terms of formal logic. For critics, this provided a welcome argument against Marxian dialectics. For Marxist proponents of this view, it served as proof of the superiority of quote dialectical logic over quote merely formal logic. Marx himself, however, rejected this interpretation. To equate the dialectical contradictions he had in mind with formal logical contradictions. And that sentence is kind of fucked up, so that might be not an accurate translation. Marx regarded statements that were contradictory in terms of formal logic, unless intended to point to a problem, as sheer nonsense. Dialectical development by no means suspends the laws of formal logic. The quote contradictions identified within a category, which necessitate a new category, are not formal, such as simultaneously attributing and denying a predicate to an object. Rather, these quote contradictions designate substantive relationships between different determinations of the category in question. As for the content of the categorical flaws or quote contradictions that drive conceptual development and the manner in which the exposition proceeds, this cannot be determined in general terms or reduced to a contradiction that simply quote unfolds even further, such as that between use value and exchange value, private and social labor, etc. The quote dialectical development intended to portray the interconnected nature of the subject matter is the outcome of a concrete research process, not the product of some sort of dialectical development machine. The more complex categories quote resolve the quote contradictions of the simpler ones. Yet in bourgeois society, these contradictions are already quote resolved. Only the mediated result is visible. Appearing, in fact, not as a result at all. Only the mediated result is visible, appearing, in fact, not as a result at all. A theoretical construction, specifically the quote dialectical exposition, unquote, is required to demonstrate that what appears immediate is actually mediated. The apparent independence of the immediate thus reveals itself to be a mere semblance, thereby enabling a critique of approaches to using categories that fall prey to the illusion of independence and immediacy. This clarifies that what Marx means by the aforementioned unity of exposition and critique, quote, at once an exposition of the system, and through that exposition a critique of it, end quote. The critique of the categories underlying bourgeois economics is not imposed from the outside, rather it must emerge from the dialectical exposition of these categories themselves. As the inadequate determination of the first category necessitates the second, a specific connection arises between the individual categories, a quote conceptual developmental relationship, end quote, intended to express the interconnection of economic relations in bourgeois society. While the ordering of the categories thus reproduces the order of the actual object, this conceptual reproduction cannot be a simple mirroring. given that it depicts mediations which are invisible, because they are always already present in their result. Neither the individual categories nor the transitions between categories possess immediate empirical reference. In bourgeois society, there exists neither the commodity not yet determined by price, with which the exposition of capital begins, nor a transition from commodity to money. The categories appearing in the exposition are therefore, quote, abstractions, yet not merely nominalistically formed generic concepts, but rather, quote, real universals, end quote. See the final chapter. When Marx asserts, quote, essential relations, end quote, against mere appearances, as in the famous statement, quote, all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things coincided directly, end quote. Marx. This does not constitute a regression to the superseded philosophy of essence. Quote, essence here refers not to normative notions standing in opposition to empirical reality, but to the non-empirical conceptual constructs that make it possible to comprehend empirical phenomena in the first place. And I think that is I think that this like reference to essence is one of the things that, what's his name, Patrick Murray, I think it's Patrick Murray that I got this from. Just like the idea, and I think like just generally people who kind of work within like the value form kind of approach talk about how like the idea of like the necessary form of appearance being like an important thing. Like when you're like trying to get to like the essence of something, when you're trying to get to like the get beyond appearances to something fundamental, that doesn't turn appearances into nothingness, right? Like essence must, and this is something they get Marxist from Hegel, I'm pretty sure, like the essence must appear, right? So appearances are not just kind of like shadows on the wall that are meaningless or insignificant or something like that, or just like a distraction. Even though appearances do produce certain fetishizations, right? That doesn't mean that those fetishizations have like a more fundamental basis that's not you can't derive from just looking at those appearances themselves. It involves like reflection and interrogating those appearances beyond themselves, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense at all. But that's just my thoughts. Thinking out loud. Forgive me. The conceptual development in Capital, therefore, differs from a mere sequence of increasingly less abstract of models in the making, although this interpretation is also widespread among Marxists. And that sentence is fucked up, so that might be incorrect. Is how that's probably not a precise translation. Anyway, as early as 1929, Grossman interpreted Marx's exposition as the progressive lifting of initial simplifying assumptions. Similar interpretations are found in Sweezy, 1942, Meek, 1967, and Dobius. That might be a mistranslation. That might be Dobbs. I'm not sure. But it could be Dobius anyway. Hellberger, 1974, also holds this position. From this model theoretic view, he draws the conclusion that the sequence of the exposition does not matter at all, since only the, quote, final formulation of the theory, end quote, is decisive. See Hellberger, 1974. Yet therein lies precisely the difference between Marx's, quote, developing exposition and a mere succession of increasingly complex models. If the progression of the exposition is reduced to the successive removal of restrictive assumptions, then a specific sequence can indeed be justified only on pragmatic or didactic grounds. It is ultimately the theorist's decision in what order to drop the limiting assumptions. This has no bearing on the explanatory power of the theory. In contrast, the conceptual development is intended, precisely through its progression, to articulate the interconnection of the categories being presented. Marx does not examine first a commodity economy without money, and subsequently one with money. Rather, he attempts to grasp the necessary connection between commodity and money. The exposition of bourgeois economics is therefore not defined by a final, quote, concrete stage, but only by the entire sequence of the conceptual development. In the course of this sequence, it also becomes clear how the capitalist mode of production generates its own presuppositions. What was initially posited at the start of the exposition is ultimately revealed to be posited by capital itself. Regarding the results of the immediate production process, Marx therefore speaks of the, quote, circular course of our exposition, end quote, Marx. Here too there is a formal resemblance to Hegel's mode of argumentation. Hegel had noted, quote, that every step of the progression in further determination, as it moves away from the indeterminate beginning, is also a return to it. That, consequently, what might initially appear distinct, the backward grounding of the beginning and the forward further determination of it, collapses into one and the same thing. End quote. Hegel. However, this regression to the ground holds a very different significance for Hegel than it does for Marx. For Hegel, the consequence is as follows, quote, by virtue of the demonstrated nature of the method, science presents itself as a circle that loops back into itself, wherein mediation loops the end back to the beginning, the simple ground at the same time. This circle is a circle of circles. For each individual element animated by the method is a reflection into itself, which in returning to the beginning is simultaneously the beginning of a new element. End quote. Hegel. By grounding its own presuppositions, science, for Hegel, renders itself independent of anything external, becoming a self-contained enterprise that presupposes nothing, a, quote, circle of circles, end quote. What Hegel celebrates at the end of the science of logic as the triumph of the method, Marx, by contrast, identifies as the point where the dialectical exposition reaches its limit. The fact that developed capitalist production generates its own preconditions implies, conversely, that it must have historically originated from other preconditions, ones not produced by itself. Therefore, Marx notes in the Grundrisse, quote, on the other hand, our method indicates the points where historical analysis must intervene, or where bourgeois economics, as a merely historical form of the production process, points beyond itself to earlier historical modes of production. End quote. Marx. The dialectical development of categories always presupposes the developed totality of capitalist production as an objective precondition. The exposition of the historical process by which this totality emerged lies outside the dialectical development of the categories. In the original draft of a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx therefore remarks during the transition from money to capital, and with regard to the existence of the free worker presupposed by this transition. Quote, his existence is the result of a protracted historical process in the economic shaping of society. At this point it becomes clearly evident that the dialectical form of exposition is correct only when it recognizes its own limits. End quote. Marx. Thus, it is not merely the character of the categories that differs between Marx and Hegel. For Marx, dialectical exposition cannot become the self-contained closed enterprise that constitutes true science for Hegel. Although dialectical development is not the only form of presentation, it nonetheless dominates the historical sections to a certain extent. It is the dialectical development of the categories that is intended to clarify at what point and in what respect a historical perspective must be introduced. Thus, in the exposition of Hegel, the existence of labor power as a commodity is initially merely presupposed. The historical process that led to this presupposition are sketched by Marx in Capital, only in the section on, quote, primitive accumulation, quote, specifically at the end of the exposition of the, quote, production process of capital, quote, rather than at the beginning. If the historicizing interpretation discussed in the previous section were correct, this point would have to appear at the start, and capital would have to be understood as the result of its formative history. The fact that it appears at the end illustrates Marx's remark. cited earlier that that human anatomy is the key to the anatomy of the ape, it is only through an analysis of the capitalist production process that it becomes clear that the separation of direct producers from the means of production, rather than the accumulation of monetary hoards in a few hands, is the central historical precondition for the capitalist mode of production. That is, only after analyzing the fundamental structure of the capital relation does it become clear which historical processes actually need to be depicted when addressing the emergence of that relation. The same applies to the historical sections on merchant capital and usurer's capital in Volume 3 of Capital. These do not precede the theoretical development, but rather follow it. However, historical material is not incorporated into the exposition solely as a precondition for an existing state of affairs. It also plays a role at points where further conceptual development is impossible, such as in determining the limits of the working day. Capital's demand for the maximum consumption of the use value of the purchased commodity, labor power, stands in opposition to the wage laborers' demand for the long-term preservation of their labor power. On the basis of commodity production, these constitute, quote, equal rights. And between equal rights, as Marx states in Chapter 8 of Volume 1 of Capital, force decides. The length of the working day cannot be determined conceptually within the framework of the development of categories. Rather, it results in the struggle between workers and capitalists. Finally, historical expositions serve a third function in Marx's presentation, illustrating the relationship depicted at a general level. Elements belonging to the dialectical development of categories form part of Marx's intended presentation of the capitalist mode of production, quote, in its ideal average, end quote, and should therefore not merely express a historical peculiarity or a specific stage of development of the capital relation. It is precisely here that errors can arise. When a merely transitory, temporary state of affairs is perceived as characteristic of the capital relation and incorporated into the development of categories. If in the course of further historical development it becomes clear that a supposedly general state of affairs was of only transitory significance, then simply supplementing Marx's presentation is insufficient, for that would amount to reducing the conceptual development to a historical one after all. Instead, it must be demonstrated within the dialectical development of the categories themselves that the supposedly general state of affairs can indeed be dispensed with in the sequence of categories. Not jumping ahead, but I think like one of the things that I'm not sure, maybe I don't want to put words in his mouth, but this is just speculation, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. For instance, Heinrich himself he thinks that the money commodity, like the idea of like beyond like a general equivalent, right? There's like the stages in the form analysis, right? The accidental relationship between commodity A, commodity B, and then the one where a single commodity represents its value in a whole bunch of different commodities as its equivalent, and then reverses that and makes it so that and explains how like commodities actually, like heterogeneous commodities actually represent their value in a singular in a single commodity. I think that Heinrich kind of thinks it should stop there, that there's like a general equivalent, right? And then like the inclusion of like a specific money commodity, say like gold or any precious metal, for instance, that's like a historical question. That's an empirical question about what form or the general equivalent takes, right? And so having any kind of like getting too specific about what the general equivalent is, like what is actually, what commodities are like measuring their value in, is something that's beyond the scope of a purely a theoretical discussion of the necessary and sufficient features of a capitalist mode of production, right? So I think Heinrich, I think Heinrich, and I think other people think this, is that it doesn't belong there. The fourth form, right, of the money commodity. because he thinks, he's like, well, for him it's like, oh yeah, with going off the gold standard, that commodities don't necessarily need to represent their value in a specific commodity. Just like, I don't know, there doesn't have to be, if you're talking about like the things where it's, I think he uses this example, if you're talking about the thing where it's like, where Marx says in Capital, it's like, it's as if amongst all of the heterogeneous animals of the animal kingdom, all the different animals in the animal kingdom, there stood this one animal that was not one of those heterogeneous animals, but the animal. I think Heinrich kind of uses the arguments like, there doesn't have to be a thing like the I think he says like, it doesn't, like the thing, the thing that value the commodity, or like the thing, money, does not have to be backed by like a thing that takes the form of like the commodity, in the sense like the commodity being something like gold, right? It doesn't have to be, there doesn't have to be like an actual commodity backing money, right? He thinks that's like he thinks that, like, I don't feel like I'm explaining this very good, but I think he's like history has actually demonstrated this, right? So like history has demonstrated that you don't actually need a commodity amongst all the commodities to represent the value of all other commodities. Like money can just be, what's it, fiat money or whatever you call it. I think that's what you call it. I think that's an example of something that's kind of put into that like Marx includes into the theoretical, it includes in his theoretical analysis of like the necessary features of capitalism. Heinrich does not think, I'm pretty sure Heinrich doesn't think that the existence of like a commodity, a specified commodity, money commodity of any kind, is a necessary feature of the capitalist mode of production, right? So, like for instance, like if we're going off the gold standard, that doesn't mean gold is replaced by another commodity or whatever that's supposed to, back the value of fiat money, right? I don't even know if I'm using that term correctly. But that would be an example, right, of something that Marx includes in the theoretical analysis that he doesn't think belongs there. That's too historically, what's the word? That's too, whether or not money is backed by a specific by a commodity or not has proven to be a historical question, right? Money no longer being backed by a particular commodity demonstrates that, and we still have a capitalist economy, it demonstrates it's like not a necessary feature of capitalism, right? So that's like an instance of something that I feel like he would take out of the analysis, right? So, and that's kind of like what a lot of these people, I don't think Heinrich doesn't attempt this himself, but a lot of the people that kind of come out of the new reading of Marx, and people who come out of the value form theory tradition itself, whether that be like Kozo Uno, or like other people in Japan, or like Christopher Arthur, they think that like Marx's critique of political economy should be like a springboard for an independent reconstruction of the critique of political economy. That Marx's analysis has tensions in it and contradictions within it that need to be revised, right? Using Marx as kind of like a springboard. So Chris Arthur does that in his most recent book. Kozo Uno does that. Thomas Sakine does it in his other way, kind of like going off of Uno, and then other people as well. So this is kind of, and I think that's kind of like, and I don't know to what extent they pursue this, but I think that's definitely one of the things of like Backhaus and Reichelt and the original Neue Marx Lektur people is like the necessary of like a reconstruction of the Critique of Political Economy. I don't know to what extent they tried to do that themselves, reconstruct the Critique of Political Economy, but there is a degree of necessity for it. I don't think Heinrich tries to do it himself either. But he's definitely one of those people that, the insertion of the necessity of a money commodity is one problem, Marxist thing. The other is one of the most fundamental things, kind of equivocating on the concept of abstract labor, right? For most value form people, such as Heinrich, who would put a lot of emphasis on this. For them, abstract labor and the substance of value is a purely social substance, right? Abstract labor is not like labor as such in like the abstract, right? That's a transhistorical category. You could say it like, oh yeah, someone putting a bear, hunting down a hunter-gatherer hunting down a boar or some kind of odd animal, I don't know, and someone coding or whatever. Both these people are engaged. Both of those are engaging in abstract labor. Indeed, they're both engaging in purposive activity with some kind of end goal in mind, right? And you can kind of like have the mental abstraction of labor between those things, right? But that's not what abstract labor is. Abstract labor is specifically like the labor that counts towards the valorization of commodities, right? It's a commodity-specific category, and that is not the same. That can't be like measured in kind of calories burned or any kind of like physical kind of way. And I think that Heinrich's doesn't try to say, oh, Marx really meant this or whatever. Or I think he kind of sort of does a bit, but he says things to the effect of his main thing. One of the main parts of Heinrich's interpretation is that Marx does in fact equivocate. He should be putting forward a purely social labor theory, social conception of abstract labor, but he does have things that give grounds to people who do indeed adopt a physicalist conception or a substantialist conception of abstract labor. That's both the one he thinks when Marx is uses that physiological conception of, or puts forward this physiological description of abstract labor, he's being incoherent, and when he uses the social one, he's being coherent. But he does concede that that's there. So that's a problem in Marx's critique of political economy. So that's the abstract labor and the money commodity are kind of instances of things that Marx includes in the kind of in the critique of political economy that I think Heinrich would argue should be excluded from it. So that's kind of he's talking about here about you can't just supplement Marx's critique of political economy as put forward by Marx. We have to kind of reconstruct. I don't know if he says reconstruct it, but okay, let me just reread that. Let me just get back to reading the text. Let me reread this fucking shit I just talked over. Elements belonging to the dialectical development of categories form part of Marx's intended presentation of the capitalist mode of production in its ideal average. Elements belonging to the dialectical development of the categories form part of Marx's intended presentation of the capitalist mode of production in its ideal average, Marx, and should therefore not merely express a historical peculiarity or a specific stage of development in the capital relation. It is precisely here that errors can arise when a merely transitory temporary state of affairs is perceived as characteristic of the capital relation and incorporated into the development of categories. If in the course of further historical development it becomes clear that a supposedly general state of affairs was of only transitory significance, then simply supplementing Marx's presentation is insufficient. And so, I guess that what he's talking about here, I think, would be something like I was talking less about the abstract labor part, but more about, I was talking about that more in the need to, reconstruct Marx's critique of political economy. But, specifically the concept of, the concept of money necessarily being backed by a specific commodity. That would be an example. Anyway, of what would be something historically specific, or something specific to a particular phase of capitalism and not indeed necessary to capitalism as such. Anyway. If in the course of further historical development it becomes clear that a supposedly general state of affairs was of only transitory significance, then simply supplementing Marx's presentation is insufficient, for that would amount to reducing the conceptual development to a historical one after all. Instead, it must be demonstrated within the dialectical development of the categories themselves that the supposedly general state of affairs can indeed be dispensed with in the sequence of categories. If this is not possible, then Marx's undertaking has, depending on the significance of the state of affairs in question for the overall argument, more or less failed. The next chapter will address precisely this problem in the context of the money commodity. Oh shit, see, I know what I'm fucking talking about. First, however, we must consider the changes to the overall architecture of the critique of political economy. Changes that have been assessed in widely varying ways in the literature. For this overall architectural structure plays a decisive role in situating the individual topics discussed in the following chapters. New section. Section 3. The original six-book plan and the distinction between, quote, capital in general and, quote, competition of the many capitals, end quote. When Marx finally began drafting his long-planned critique of political economy in 1857, he did not yet have a detailed plan in mind. The introduction written at the outset contains only a very rough outline. Draft plans emerged only in the course of the work and reflect specific insights into the structural interrelationships of bourgeois society. Upon completing the Grundrisse, Marx envisaged the aforementioned division into 6 books. In the first 3 books, Capital, Landed Property, Wage Labor, he intended to deal with, quote, the economic conditions of life of the 3 great classes into which modern bourgeois society is divided, end quote. The further subdivision of the book on capital into 4 sections, as well as the structure of the first section, are evident from 2 letters, one to Engels dated 2nd of April 1858, and one to LaSalle dated 11th of March 1858. This results in the structure of the planned critique of political economy outlined on the next page. This extensive work was intended to... let me say, I think I should skip ahead after this paragraph to get to this planned outline. Book 1 on capital, with the headings A. Capital in general, subheading value, subheading money, subheading capital in general. Production of process of capital, circulation process of capital, unity of the two are capital and profit, interest. B. Competition or the action of the many capitals upon one another. C. Credit. D. Joint stock capital. Book 2, Landed Property. Book 3, Wage Labor. Book 4, The State. Book 5, International Trade. Book 6, The World Market. This extensive work was intended to appear in several installments. The first and only installment, published in 1859, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Part 1, covered only points 1 and 2, parenthesis, as Chapter 1, the commodity, and Chapter 2, money or simple circulation, in parenthesis. With the 1861-63 manuscript, Marx intended to elaborate on point 3, capital in general. It is titled, quote, Chapter 3, Capital in General, and was thus initially still situated within the plan just outlined. As already mentioned, however, while working on this manuscript, Marx decided to publish the continuation of the 1859 text as an independent work under the title Capital. There has since been fierce debate in the literature regarding the relationship between the 3 volumes of Capital published from 1867 onwards and this original outline. Do they represent the execution of only a small or large part of the plan, or was the 3-volume Capital based on an entirely new structural plan? Marx himself did not express a definitive view on this. In the letter to Kugelmann dated the 28th of December 1862, in which he announced Capital as an independent work for the first time, he still refers to the 1858-59 plan and characterizes the scope of the planned work as follows, quote, It comprises, in fact, only what was intended to form the 3rd chapter of the first section, namely capital in general. Thus it does not include the competition of capitals in the credit system. What the English call the, quote, principles of political economy, end quote, is contained in this volume. It is the quintessence, parenthesis, together with the first part, a contribution to the critique of political economy, Michael Heinrich, in parenthesis, and the development of what follows, parenthesis, with the possible exception of the relationship between the various forms of state and the various economic structures of society, in parenthesis, should be easy for others to carry out on the basis of what has been provided, end quote, Marx. Thus, at least for December 1862, it is clear that Marx intended to realize only a small part of his 6-book plan within Capital. Specifically, the remainder of the first section of the first book, material that had been missing from a contribution to the critique of political economy. In the years that followed, however, Marx makes no further mention of the 6-book plan or of, quote, capital in general, a concept central to his work between 1857 and 1863, yet one he never used again in either manuscripts or correspondence after 1863. Instead, the 3 volumes of Capital contain important themes one would have expected to find in the projected books on wage labor and landed property, such as the analysis of the wage form or the limits of the working day in Volume 1, and the investigation of ground rent in Volume 3, as well as topics relating to the remaining sections of the Capital project, namely the competition of capitals, credit, and joint stock capital, in Volume 3. It is therefore not entirely implausible that, in the 3 volumes of Capital, Marx ultimately deals not only with the section on, quote, capital in general, but also with the subject matter of the first 3 books concerning capital, landed property, and wage labor. On the other hand, Capital the book still refers to specific investigations into wage labor, landed property, and competition that were potentially intended to follow. Yet the complete abandonment of the term, quote, capital in general could also indicate that the entire structural plan had changed, meaning the 3 volumes of Capital can no longer be interpreted against the backdrop of the original 1858/59 plan. To discuss this issue of a change in plan, it is first necessary to examine the concept of, quote, capital in general more closely. It was primarily through Roman Rozdolsky's commentary on the Grundrisse published in 1968 that the distinction between, quote, capital in general and quote, competition became enormously influential in German, and following the English translation, Anglo-Saxon discourse, although the concept of, quote, capital in general does not appear in Capital at all. It subsequently came to be regarded as a veritable master key for understanding that work's architectural structure. With the distinction between, quote, capital in general, unquote, and the, quote, competition of many capitals, unquote, Marx reflects a specific insight into the structural interconnectedness of bourgeois society. The novelty of this insight becomes apparent when compared with Marx's economic analyses from the 1840s. Those early analyses were oriented primarily toward market processes, with Marx viewing competition as the decisive mechanism for explaining a wide variety of phenomena. In Wage, Labor, and Capital of 1849, for instance, he attributes both the movement of wages and the development of productive forces to competition. In the Grundrisse, by contrast, a completely new conception of competition emerges. There it is stated, quote, competition in general, this essential locomotive of bourgeois economy, does not establish its laws, but is their executor. Unlimited competition is therefore not the precondition for the truth of economic laws, but rather their consequence. the phenomenal form in which their necessity is realized, end quote. Marx. While Ricardo simply presupposes unrestricted competition in order to investigate the laws of capital, treating it as a mere hypothesis of the theorist, appearing, quote, externally and arbitrarily, not as developments of capital itself, but as posited presuppositions of capital, end quote. Marx. Marx here sets himself the task of grounding competition itself as a manifestation of the laws of capital. With this critique, Marx strikes at the heart of bourgeois liberal moral philosophy and political economy, as classically expressed in Mandeville's Fable of the Bees and Smith's, quote, invisible hand. Marx had already noted this at the beginning of the Grundrisse. Quote, economists express it thus: everyone pursues their private interest and only their private interest, and thereby serves, without intending or knowing it, the private interest of all, the general interest. The point is not that by everyone pursuing their private interest, the totality of private interest, and thus the general interest, is achieved. Rather, the crucial point is that private interest is itself already a socially determined interest, and can be realized only within the conditions posited by society and with the means provided by it. It is thus bound to the reproduction of these conditions and means. It is the interest of private individuals, yet its content, as well as the form and means of its realization, are determined by social conditions independent of them all. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. In other words, the general bourgeois interest does not miraculously emerge only as the result of the pursuit of private interest. Rather, it is present from the very outset within the act of that pursuit, insofar as it already shapes the private interest from whose interaction it subsequently arises. This is simply another way of expressing the critique of individualism found in the theoretical field of political economy. It is not simply individuals who constitute society, rather it is social structures that make available to individuals specific positions from which they can perform their, quote, constitutive acts, and, quote. If one applies this insight to competition, the following conclusion emerges, quote, conceptually, competition is nothing other than the inner nature of capital, its essential determination, appearing and realizing itself as the interaction of many capitals with one another, the inner tendency manifesting as external necessity, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Marx now explicitly argues against explaining general laws in terms of competition. Quote, competition executes the inner laws of capital. Competition turns them into coercive laws for the individual capital. But it does not invent them. It realizes them. Therefore, to attempt to explain them simply through competition is to admit that one does not understand them, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. With the realization that the laws governing the inner nature of capital are merely realized through the actual movement of individual capitals, Marx achieved a qualitative breakthrough beyond the market-oriented analyses of the 1840s. His main challenge now lay in capturing this new insight using adequate categories. As will become clear below, the distinction between, quote, capital in general, end quote, and the, quote, competition of many capitals, end quote, is by no means identical to this new insight, which is central to the critique of political economy. Rather, it represents the first attempt to fix this insight in categorical terms. Although the literature on Marx's Capital has made extensive use of this distinction since the late 1960s, a precise analysis of these concepts is notably absent. Rosdolsky, for instance, defines the content of, quote, capital in general as the totality of characteristics common to all individual capitals, identifying valorization as the characteristic shared by all of them. This requires first an analysis of the immediate production process to explain the production of surplus value, and subsequently an analysis of the circulation process as a necessary complement to the production process. Due to the circulation process, surplus value appears to be determined not only by the surplus labor appropriated during the immediate production process, but also by circulation time. When surplus value is measured against the total advanced capital, it assumes the transformed form of profit, the concept with which Rosdolsky concludes the section on capital in general. He argues that the formation of the general rate of profit cannot be depicted here, as it presupposes competition, something from which the analysis is intended to abstract at this stage. While it is true that Marx explicitly excludes the treatment of the average rate of profit from the exposition of capital in general on several occasions, this very fact demonstrates that capital in general cannot be reduced to a merely nominalist concept of a generic category. If capital in general were indeed to encompass only those determinations common to all individual capitals, as Rosdolsky maintains, then average profit would also be included. Moreover, Rosdolsky's definition of the substantive scope of capital in general does not align with the section Marx had planned, as is evident from the various outlines Marx drafted, which Rosdolsky himself reproduced. Marx intended for the treatment of capital in general to conclude not with simple profit, but with interest, an element for which Rosdolsky's conception of capital in general apparently finds no proper place. Let us now attempt to define more precisely the conceptual framework expressed in the distinction between capital in general and competition. In the Grundrisse, Marx first employs the term capital in general during his analysis of the production process. After addressing the concepts of capital held by bourgeois economists, he summarizes the requirements he sets for his own exposition. Capital, insofar as we consider it here as a relation distinct from value and money, is capital in general, that is, the totality of the determinations that distinguish value as capital from itself as mere value or money. Marx. Capital in general is thus intended to encompass all those determinations that must be added to value for it to become capital. Determinations, that make value into capital in general, and which for this very reason apply to every individual capital. However, the exposition of capital in general involves abstracting not only from the existence of the many capitals, but also from the individual capital as such. The latter is not the subject of the exposition. Marx continues, but here we are dealing neither with a particular form of capital, nor with the individual capital as distinct from other individual capitals, etc. We are witnessing its process of coming into being. This dialectical process of coming into being is merely the ideal expression of the real movement in which capital comes into being. Marx, Grundrisse. This real movement in which capital comes into being, which the dialectical process of coming into being, is meant to express, is not the historical emergence of capital, but rather the process by which a mere sum of value transforms into capital. Capital in general, as the conceptual reproduction of capital's inner nature, and as the dialectical development of its determinations, in the sense explained in the second edition of this chapter, is therefore something entirely different from a mere presentation of the properties shared by individual capitals. What appears in competition is to be developed at the abstract level of capital in general, and Marx therefore finds himself compelled to abstract from the competition during this development. What appears in competition is to be developed at the abstract level of capital in general, and Marx therefore finds himself compelled to abstract from competition during this development. At this point, it is crucial to understand exactly what Marx includes under the competition of the many capitals. He uses this term to encompass not only the actual movement of individual capitals, but any relationship involving many capitals, regardless of the level of abstraction. Thus, at one point in the Grundrisse, after Marx had just encountered problems regarding the circulation process, it is stated categorically, since we are speaking here of capital in the process of becoming, we have nothing outside of it as yet, inasmuch as the many capitals do not yet exist for us. Marx, Grundrisse. Presenting the determinations of capital in general, in abstraction from competition, implies, given the extensive understanding of competition, that Marx held a considerable restriction on the substantive scope of capital in general. On the other hand, and this was mostly overlooked in the discussion, There is also a specific content that must be presented. Within the section on, quote, capital in general, unquote, capital must, in fact, be determined in its, quote, finished form. All determinations that merely appear and assert themselves in competition must be developed without reference to competition. Marx thus places two distinct demands on the section dealing with, quote, capital in general, unquote. On the one hand, its content is to be presented at a specific level of abstraction from competition, parenthesis, which encompasses both the actual movement and all the relations between the many capitals, and parenthesis. On the other hand, the presentation is to have a specific substantive scope, is to encompass all the determinations that become visible in competition. New section, section 4. The dissolution of, quote, capital in general. Simultaneously fulfilling the two aforementioned requirements for the section on, quote, capital in general, subsequently proved to be an insoluble problem. Initial difficulties emerged as early as the Grundrisse. When presenting the circulation process of capital, Marx encountered the problem that the material elements of capital, as well as the means of subsistence, must be reproduced. That this simultaneous reproduction can only be depicted by considering the exchange between different capitals. It thus becomes apparent that the imminent determinations of the circulation process necessitate the presentation of distinct capitals, something that is, however, impossible given the level of abstraction at which, quote, capital in general is to be treated. Marx was left with nothing but the categorical assertion, quote, here the form can still be assumed in which a single capital operates, because we are considering capital as such, end quote. Marx. Another problem arose regarding the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit. If a general law truly exists, it must be presented prior to the analysis of competition, that is, within the section on, quote, capital in general. On the other hand, Marx is well aware that it is the average rate of profit that falls. Yet the average rate of profit is intended to be dealt with only in the section on competition, which would imply addressing it after the law governing its decline. Finally, Marx's uncertainty was also evident in his remark that, quote, capital in general was not merely an abstraction capturing the differentia specifica of capital, but itself possessed a, quote, real existence, a point acknowledged by bourgeois economists in their, quote, theory of equalizations, end quote. However, Marx never precisely explained what he meant by this, quote, real existence, end quote. Indeed, he uses the term in only this one instance. Compared to the Grundrisse, the 1861-63 manuscript exhibits a number of conceptual changes reflecting a more advanced stage of Marx's analysis. For instance, the increase in productive forces as a method for producing relative surplus value is treated systematically here for the first time. Furthermore, the section on the production process of capital incorporated topics that in the Grundrisse had been relegated to the planned book on wage labor, such as the lengthening of the working day or the employment of women and children. This inclusion was by no means arbitrary, rather it stemmed from the insight that these were tendencies imminent to capital. This also foreshadows the later abandonment of the plan to present the living conditions of the three great classes in a separate volume. It is also interesting that Marx now includes accumulation in his exposition of the production process. In the Grundrisse, he had excluded it on the grounds that doing so would require an examination of, quote, many capitals. There, he had consistently understood accumulation as the transformation of profit into capital, occurring within the context of an individual capital. What he now incorporates into the exposition is the transformation of surplus value into capital. While these changes do not fundamentally conflict with the concept of, quote, capital in general, two further developments take place that effectively shatter the framework of, quote, capital in general. The exposition of the reproduction and circulation of the aggregate social capital, and that of the average rate of profit. Marx is led to consider the aggregate social capital through his critique of the, quote, Smithian dogma. Adam Smith had claimed that the entire value of commodities resolves into wages and profit, including rent, on the grounds that the portion of commodity value attributable to constant capital could also be reduced to wages and to profit. From this followed Smith's view that the total annual value of the product likewise resolves into wages and profit, and rent. Marx, by contrast, insists that the constant capital component cannot be so resolved. He is then faced with the problem of explaining how the annually produced commodities, the value of which is composed not only of profit and wages, but also of the value of consumed constant capital, can be purchased using annual profits and wages. After several attempts, Marx finally succeeds in essentially solving this problem by distinguishing between two departments of the aggregate social capital, one producing means of production and the other producing means of consumption, and examining the exchange between them. Various statements by Marx indicate that he intended to present this point within the context of the circulation process of capital, that is, within the section dealing with the capital in general. However, in doing so, he departs from the level of abstraction established there. Not only does the category of the total social capital not quite fit the distinction between capital in general and competition, nor is it used systematically in the Grundrisse, but the various departments of the total social capital are, particular forms of capital, and were as such explicitly excluded from the exposition of, capital in general, Marx addresses the second point, the presentation of the average rate of profit, in theories of surplus value, when considering whether the existence of an, absolute rent is compatible with the law of value. In a digression here, Marx addresses the average rate of profit and attempts to explain its formation through a twofold movement in the competition between capitals within the same sphere of production. Competition leads to the formation of a uniform market value between spheres of production. It transforms values into, average prices, which Marx calls, prices of production only in capital, thereby enabling the realization of the average profit. Marx is thus able to explain the possibility of an absolute rent on the basis of the law of value. If the value of agricultural products exceeds the, average price, yet they are nonetheless sold at their value because agricultural products do not enter into the equalization process leading to the average rate of profit, then, in addition to the average profit, an extra profit is realized. Which the landowner appropriates as absolute rent. Marx then decides to include both the equalization process leading to the average rate of profit and absolute rent, specifically as a, illustration of this process, in the section on capital in general. See the letter to Engels dated August 2nd, 1862. Although he does not provide an explicit justification for this, a clue can be found somewhat later in the digression, revenue and its sources. There Marx notes that interest, which was intended to conclude the exposition of capital in general, as early as the Grundrisse, conceptually presupposes profit, specifically in the form of average profit. The section on capital and profit then clearly reveals the difficulties. And this is kind of a sketchy translation here, or it looks sketchy. It looks like it didn't pick something up, or couldn't pick something up. The section on capital and profit then clearly reveals the difficulties. Marx's aim here is to present the average rate of profit, and thus a part of, competition, within the framework of, capital in general. While he intends to deal with the average rate of average profit there, he plans to include the, competitive relationship and, merely as a, illustration. A little later, however, he adds a qualifying remark, a closer examination of this point belongs in the chapter on competition. Nevertheless, the decisive general aspects must be presented here, Marx. The general aspect Marx wishes to present is the relationship of surplus value to total capital, viewed both as a process of the individual capital and as a process of the total social capital. He attempts to maintain the distinction between, capital in general and, competition, by emphasizing that competition is merely the, agency that carries out the calculation of the average profit. Yet it is not only the fact that the average profit, which Marx now recognizes as inherent to the nature of capital, presupposes an analysis of competition that calls Marx's concept of quote, capital in general into question. The increasingly important distinction between individual capital and total social capital also fails to fit into this concept. Indeed, it undermines it. Although Marx does not explicitly reflect on this problem, the nature of his exposition seems to cause him some concern. Regarding the next point, which deals with the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, he writes with a sense of palpable relief, quote, "Here, then, we are back on firm ground, where the general law can be derived directly from the general nature of capital developed thus far, without having to go into the competition among the many capitals," end quote. Marx. In various outlines, Marx then solidifies the changes described, specifically the presentation of the average rate of profit. In their introduction to the 1861-63 manuscript, the mega editors draw the following conclusions from this. Quote, Marx's intensive work on the manuscript ultimately culminated in a new outline, which he sketched out in January 1863 in Notebook 18. With this, the structure of the future capital was essentially established. By incorporating the theory of average profit into the exposition, the previously intended separation between quote, capital in general and competition was abandoned, and Marx ceased using the term quote, capital in general thereafter. End quote. Mega editors. However, this is only partially true. While the changes made in the draft outlines did indeed call into question the old conception of quote, capital in general, Marx himself had not yet realized this. He was still attempting to hold fast to that conception. Not only did Marx, at the time he was drafting the outlines, explicitly refer to the distinction between quote, capital in general and quote, competition in the letter to Kugelmann, dated December 28, 1862, cited earlier, but the editors claim that Marx ceased using the term quote, capital in general after drafting those outlines is also incorrect. It does appear once more that it does appear once more after that point. Above all, however, Marx could not simply quote, abandon the separation between quote, capital in general and quote, competition, as the editors imply. After all, it was constitutive of the entire exposition. If it is truly abandoned, which does indeed happen, though only at a later stage, a new structural concept must take its place. Yet Marx had not yet developed such a concept in the 1861-63 manuscript. In this respect, by December 1862, he had discovered essential elements of the future capital, the book, but not yet its structure. With the necessary inclusion of the reproduction of the aggregate social capital and the average rate of profit, the old conception of quote, capital in general end quote, effectively dissolved. The two requirements placed upon it to present specific content at a specific level of abstraction could no longer be met simultaneously. Marx, however, was not fully aware of this. A new structure emerged only gradually with the distinction between individual capital and aggregate social capital, a distinction that cut across the old conception, becoming increasingly important. New section, Section 5, The Structure of Capital, the book. Opinions in the literature diverge widely regarding the relationship between the structure of capital, the book, and the original plan, specifically concerning the significance still attributed to, quote, capital in general. Two fundamental positions stand in opposition. On the one hand, it is argued that the conception of, quote, capital in general underlies the structure of Marx's capital. On the other, it is assumed that the concept of, quote, capital in general was effectively abandoned or superseded. Vygotsky, who investigated the genesis of Marx's capital as early as the 1960s, argued that the 3 volumes of Capital remain at the level of, quote, capital in general, although they also incorporate material originally intended for later sections. See Vygotsky, 1967. I think it's Vitaly Vygotsky. Rozdalsky likewise identifies a, quote, process of progressive narrowing of the original plan, which, however, corresponded to an expansion of its remaining part, end quote. Specifically, quote, the intention to present competition, the credit system, and joint stock capital separately was abandoned, while the first section dealing with, quote, capital in general, end quote, was progressively expanded, end quote. Rozdalsky, 1968. However, Rosdolsky does not address the question of whether a, quote, expansion of the section on, quote, capital in general is even possible without destroying the underlying concept. This expansion is characterized as follows, quote, like the rough draft, the Grundrisse, volumes 1 and 2 of Capital limit themselves merely to the examination of, quote, capital in general, unquote. The actual methodological difference begins only with the third volume, end quote. Rosdolsky. Thereby the boundaries of, quote, capital in general are, quote, widely exceeded, end quote. Rosdolsky. Quote, here then the earlier fundamental distinction between the analysis of, quote, capital in general and that of, quote, competition is abandoned, end quote. Rosdolsky. For Rosdolsky, Marx's change of plan amounts to nothing more than the regrouping of specific topics within the sequence of the exposition. Yet Rosdolsky offers no concrete reasons for the necessity of such a change. Rosdolsky states only in general terms that the strict opposition between, quote, capital in general and, quote, competition was a provisional, quote, working model, end quote. One that was later discarded as a, quote, hindering and superfluous restriction, end quote. Rosdolsky. Without, however, elaborating on the nature of this hindrance. Since Rosdolsky reduces the change of plan to a mere rearrangement of content and perceives no alteration in the structural concept, Rosdolsky concludes, quote, we believe, therefore, that we have found in the categories of, quote, capital in general and, quote, many capitals, that is, competition, the key to understanding not only the rough draft but also the later work, namely, capital, end quote. Rosdolsky. Rosdolsky's view has significantly influenced the interpretation of Marx's Capital. Its central weakness lies in the failure to clarify how the alleged, quote, expansion of, quote, capital in general, or the superimposition of other structural principles assumed by some authors, could possibly occur without destroying the concept's internal logic. A number of authors have also concluded that the concept of, quote, capital in general, and, quote, dissolved. Jahn and Nietzold, 1978, even speak explicitly of the concept being, quote, blown apart. Yet the arguments offered for this dissolution generally remain at a nebulous abstract level. Jahn and Nietzold, for instance, state that the, quote, strict formulation of the concept of, quote, capital in general, and, quote, made it difficult to systematically integrate the new discoveries of the years 1861 to 63 into the logical exposition of the ascent from the abstract to the concrete, end quote. Marx. Jahn and Nietzold. However, the nature of this, quote, difficulty and why this, quote, integration had to take place precisely where it called the concept of, quote, capital in general, end quote, into question remains obscure. Botter et al., 1975, also justify the move beyond, quote, capital in general using rather vague arguments. They contend that it is, quote, inconsistent with the structure of capital as a self-producing subject, to keep the foundation, principle, or inner nature, on the one hand, abstractly separate from its necessary manifestations, the phenomena of competition on the other, end quote. Similarly, in their introduction to the first edition of Volume 1 of Capital, the mega-editors speak only very imprecisely of Marx sensing the, quote, substantive limitations, end quote, of, quote, capital in general, end quote, and consequently deciding against making it the, quote, principal structural perspective, end quote. The mega-editors. Without, however, specifying what did constitute the, quote, principal structural perspective, end quote, in Marx's Capital. All these approaches merely state the fact that the concept of, quote, capital in general was superseded, yet it remains unclear both why, quote, capital in general had to be abandoned and what structural concept took its place. Before examining the structural principles that replaced, quote, capital in general, end quote, it is advisable to first compare the content with the original six-book plan. In this regard, Rosdolsky had already drawn a strict distinction between the first three books, Capital, Ground, Rent, Wage, Labor, and the last three, State, Foreign Trade, World Market. One must agree with him that while the content of the last three books is not addressed in Marx's Capital, the 3 volumes of Capital encompass far more than the originally envisaged, quote, book on capital. They also contain essential material from the book's plan to cover landed property and wage labor. The quote special theory of wage labor and the quote independent treatment of landed property mentioned by Marx in Capital, which are potentially intended to follow later, represent specialized inquiries not comparable to the investigations originally planned. Through his exposition of the struggle over the limits of the working day, the impact of machinery on working conditions, the general law of capitalist accumulation, and the revenue forms of wages and rent, Marx addresses the fundamentals of the economic conditions of life of the three economic classes the very subject matter intended for the first three books. Since these living conditions are so inextricably linked to the laws of capital, a separate treatment was no longer feasible. Consequently, in the preface to the first edition, Marx defines the subject matter of capital as the investigation of the capitalist mode of production or the economic law of motion of modern society Marx. It is important to note here that Marx was concerned neither with capitalism in a specific country nor with capitalism in a specific epoch. Quote, in and of itself, the issue is not the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonisms arising from the natural laws of the capitalist mode of production. Quote, in and of itself, the issue is not the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonisms arising from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is a question of these laws themselves, Marx. This point must be emphasized, particularly in contrast to the stage theory interpretations that prevailed both in early social democracy and within Marxism-Leninism. These interpretations assume that Marx analyzed the competitive capitalism of the 19th century, while Hilferding, Luxemburg, Lenin, and others analyzed the finance capital and monopoly capitalism of the 20th century. As for the originally planned 4 sections of the book on capital in general, competition, credit, and share capital, Marx's Capital does indeed contain essential elements of these sections. Rosdolsky has already correctly cataloged the mere shifting of the individual topics. However, the structure of the exposition has changed. It no longer follows the earlier separation into capital in general and competition. Marx formally acknowledges this by using the term capital in general, neither as a structural heading nor anywhere else in the text of Capital. The abandonment of the old conception did not result from arbitrary expansions or general methodological considerations. Rather, it had to be discarded because it proved unfeasible. The concept of capital in general was shattered because, by abstracting from the movement of the many capitals, it was impossible to develop all the formal determinations necessary for the transition from generality to actual movement. The dual requirement Marx imposed on capital in general, namely to treat specific content at a specific level of abstraction, proved impossible to realize. In the case of both the total process of reproduction and the process of equalization, to the average rate of profit, one must consider a specific relationship between individual capital and total social capital. Yet the exposition of such a relationship appears to result in a circular argument. On the one hand, since individual capitals constitute total social capital, they must be viewed independently of and prior to it. On the other hand, total capital imposes limits on the movement of total capital imposes limits on the movement of individual capitals, such that the exposition of individual capitals presupposes the exposition of total capital. Marx addresses this problem in Capital by examining both individual capital and the constitution of total social capital, not merely once but repeatedly, at varying levels of abstraction. That is to say, neither the individual capital nor the total capital that Marx initially takes as his subject matter represents the fully determined phenomena as they appear empirically. In Capital, the old conception of capital in general versus competition has been replaced by an examination of individual capital and the constitution of total social capital across 3 successive levels of exposition. The the immediate production process, the circulation process, and the total process, the unity of production and circulation. This structure becomes evident not only when reading the 3 volumes of Capital. Marx himself points to it, albeit not in the explicit manner which he previously addressed the distinction between, quote, capital in general and quote, competition, end quote. In the first volume of Marx's Capital, individual capital is initially examined at the level of the immediate production process. Here abstraction is made from any interaction with other capitals. Initially the focus is solely on the production of surplus value and of capital itself, that is, accumulation. Chapter 23 then begins the examination of the constitution of the aggregate social capital. At the stage of exposition reached thus far, individual capitals differ only in terms of their magnitude and organic composition. Consequently, statements regarding the aggregate capital can only be made in these terms. It appears as a mere arithmetic sum of the individual capitals. Yet even at this abstract level, the impact of the movement of the aggregate capital or individual capitals becomes apparent, for instance, in the first 2 subsections of Chapter 23, which consider the consequences of accumulation under conditions of constant versus rising capital composition. At the level of analysis, the circulation process of capital presented in Volume 2 of Capital, the first 2 sections analyze the circuit and turnover of individual capital. Individual capitals no longer exist merely side by side. Consequently, the total social capital, dealt with in the 3rd section of Volume 2, is no longer constituted as a mere sum of individual capitals. At this stage of abstraction, the following holds true. Quote, the circuits of individual capitals, however, intertwine, presuppose, and condition one another, and precisely in this intertwining, from the movement of the total social capital. Quote, Marx. The total capital is now considered in terms of its reproduction process. Since this process requires a specific proportioning in terms of both value and material substance, it in turn imposes limits on the movement of individual capitals. Even at the level of Volume 3, which deals with the total process of capitalist production, as the unity of the production and circulation processes, Marx initially presents the transformation of surplus value into profit as a process occurring at the level of individual capital. At this stage, the individual capitals that produce profit constitute the total social capital by establishing a general rate of profit. The process that accomplishes this is no longer merely the intertwining of their circuits, but rather, quote, competition, not in the sense of perfect competition, but as a specific mechanism of socialization. That is a process that transforms individual capitals into uniform components of the total social capital. Quote, in this form, capital becomes conscious of itself as a social power in which every capitalist participates pro rata to his share in the total capital of the society, end quote. Marx. Although the general rate of profit is established through the competition among individual capitals, it confronts the individual capital as a pre-existing condition and in turn determines its movement. Furthermore, it serves as the prerequisite for more advanced determinations of form, such as interest and ground rent. It was shown above that the Grundrisse differ fundamentally from Marx's economic analyses of the 1840s through the recognition of the distinction between immanent laws of capital and their enforcement within the actual movement of the many capitals. Marx initially attempted to account for this new insight by distinguishing between, quote, capital in general and, quote, competition. However, with the abandonment of this concept in Capital, that insight, this is a fuck up in the translation. That insight, by no means lost. I mean, maybe it says that insight is by no means lost. The old conception incorporated a very specific idea of what was to be understood by the, quote, real movement of capitals, which is supposed to be depicted under the heading of, quote, competition, namely all relations involving many capitals, regardless of the level of abstraction. Consequently, the exposition of the immanent laws of capital was intended to proceed in abstraction from all relations concerning the many capitals. Now, on the one hand, Marx recognized that an exposition of the immanent laws subject to this restriction was not possible. On the other hand, this implies that the, quote, real movement of competition, in quote, in which the laws of capital are merely executed, is not identical to the movement of the many capitals either, but constitutes only a part of it. And this part is also omitted from the exposition of capital. Quote, in the exposition of the objectification of the relations of production, and their acquiring an existence independent of the agents of production themselves, we do not go into the way in which these connections appear to them, and assert themselves against them, as overpowering natural laws and blind necessity that rule over them against their will. Connections mediated by the world market, its fluctuations, the movement of market prices, the periods of credit, the cycles of industry and trade, and the various epochs of prosperity, crisis, etc. We do not do so because the real movement of competition, etc., lies outside our plan, and we have only to present the inner organization of the capitalist mode of production, in its ideal average, so to speak. Marx. The, quote, real movement of competition, in quote, continues to be relegated to a separate, quote, treatise, quote, on competition. Even after the structure of Marx's Capital has been reasonably clarified, significant problems remain, particularly in the third volume. Whether regarding the reflections on crisis theory following the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, or the analysis of credit that succeeds the treatment of interest-bearing capital, it's not always clear whether Marx crossed the boundary into the, quote, actual movement of competition, end quote, or precisely where within the fragmentary manuscript the presentation of the theory shifts into research. Marx's intentions in this regard have become clearer following the publication of the original manuscript than they were in the edition edited by Engels, as Engels had softened the edge of some of Marx's methodological remarks, a point I will return to in chapters 7 and 8. Such problems involve not merely questions of textual interpretation, but the fundamental issue of the level of abstraction at which credit and crisis can be addressed, specifically whether a presentation at the general level of capital, Marx's Capital, the book, is feasible, or whether credit and crisis elude such treatment because historically variable institutional conditions lying outside the level of abstraction of Marx's Capital come into play. And that's at the end of the that's the end of the body. Now we're at footnotes. Footnote 1. These London notebooks, produced between 1850 and 1853, were published in excerpted form alongside the Grundrisse. The complete publication in the Mega has not yet been concluded. Regarding these notebooks, see in particular Schrader, 1980, Part 1, Jahn, 1987, and the contributions published in Arbeitsblätter zur Marx-Engels-Forschung. 2. Regarding the manuscript sections published here for the first time, see the Anthology by Jahn and Müller, as well as the commentary by Otto and Bischoff, 1984. And footnote. Footnote 3. Marx also planned a fourth book on the history of theory, though he never actually undertook it. The fact that the theories of surplus value published in the Marx-Engels-Werke edition under the subtitle, quote, the fourth volume of Capital, unquote, do not constitute a draft of this book, was already discussed above at the end of the second chapter. And footnote. Footnote 4. Works by Mickiewicz et al., 1982, Antonova et al., 1984, Mickiewicz/Vygotsky, 1985, provide an overview of Marx's work on capital during the period 1863 to 67. And footnote. Footnote 5. The editorial history of Marx's text is presented in greater detail by Rolf Hecker in Outvater, Hecker, Heinrich, and Schaeper-Rinkel, 1999. And footnote. Footnote 6. While Engels asserts in the preface to the volume he edited, he had limited the actual editing, quote, to the bare essentials, having preserved the character of the first draft wherever clarity permitted, end quote. Engels' intention is expressed more clearly in a letter to Danielson dated 4th of July, 1884. Quote, but since this concluding volume is such a magnificent and completely unassailable work, I consider it my duty to bring it out in a form where the overall line of argumentation emerges clearly and vividly. Given the state of this manuscript, a first draft often interrupted and incomplete, that is not exactly easy, end quote. Engels wanted to publish a largely self-contained work that would serve the labor movement as an intellectual weapon, an aim entirely understandable given the political situation of the time and Engels' stature as a leading figure of the Second International. However, this means that Engels' edition of Capital is essentially a pre-interpreted study edition. Points that remained obscure or ambiguous to Engels and Marx's manuscript are presented in a way he assumed aligned with the, quote, overall line of argumentation, and, quote, without making it clear to the reader to what extent the text presented relies on substantive editorial decisions made by Engels. I will address some of these interventions in chapters 7 and 8. The changes made by Engels are discussed in detail by Fulgraf/Jungnickel, 1995, Fulgraf, 1997, and Heinrich, 1996/97. Criticism of Engels' edition of the third volume of Capital prompted some defenses that were motivated more by emotion than by objective argument. Quite apart from the fact that placing the ever-combative Engels on an unassailable pedestal would actually do him a disservice, he himself possessed an extraordinary degree of self-criticism. In a letter to Johann Philipp Becker, written after Marx's death, he stated, quote, all my life I have done what I was cut out to do, namely play second fiddle. ... But if I am now to take Marx's place in matters of theory and play first fiddle, things are bound to go awry, and no one is more aware of this than I am. End quote. Engels, letter dated October 15, 1884, and footnote. Footnote, a commentary on the third volume based on Marx's manuscript has since been published by Bischoff and Otto, 1993. However, this work is more in the nature of an introduction focused on specific themes than a text-critical commentary. Behrens, 1995, examines the first two chapters of the manuscript, which correspond to the first two sections of Engels' edition. And footnote. Footnote 8. Thought 2 is dialectical only because it is a reflection of the real dialectic rooted in the objective world. Quote, dialectics, so-called objective dialectics, prevail throughout nature, and so-called subjective dialectics, dialectical thought, are merely a reflection of the movement of opposites that assert itself everywhere in nature, end quote. Marx. And footnote. Footnote 9. For critiques of Engels and discussions regarding differences between Engels and Marx, see among others Schmidt, 1962, and Dudek, 1976. A nuanced analysis set against the backdrop of 19th century developments in philosophy and the natural sciences was provided by Liedman, 1986. See also Liedman, 1996. Riedel, 1994, drew attention to differences in the way Marx and Engels received Hegel, differences that account for a number of points of divergence. And footnote. Footnote. Marx explicitly states, quote, is therefore not necessary in order to develop the laws of bourgeois economy to write the actual history of the relations of production, end quote. Marx. And footnote. Footnote 11. A detailed examination of Engels' review in the context of, quote, logical and, quote, historical conceptions in the work of Marx and Engels is provided by Kittsteiner, 1977. Regarding the critique of Engels, see also Backhaus, 1975 and 1997, as well as Skredov, 1997. And footnote. Footnote. Riedel, 1993, demonstrates that this debate was far more complex and was not limited to the question of dialectics, which is almost exclusively discussed in the literature. And footnote. Footnote. In addition to the remarks in the afterword, there are several similar passages in letters. And footnote. Footnote 13. In his notes on Hegel's Science of Logic, and against the backdrop of social democracy's failure at the outbreak of war, Lenin wrote, quote, it is impossible to fully grasp Marx's Capital, especially the first chapter, without having studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, not a single Marxist has understood Marx after half a century, end quote. Lenin. Lukács, who following the defeats of the revolutionary movements in the West, sought to redefine, quote, orthodox Marxism, and anchored this orthodoxy precisely in method, held the view that regardless of the explicit use of Hegelian terms, quote, a whole series of the decisive categories of method constantly employed, end quote, in Marx's Capital derived directly from Hegel's logic. End footnote. Footnote 15. On February 1st, 1858, Marx wrote to Engels regarding Lassalle, quote, I see from this note that the fellow intends to present political economy in a Hegelian manner in his second major work. Lassalle will learn to his own detriment that it is a very different matter to bring a science to the point where it can be presented dialectically through the process of critique than it is to apply an abstract ready-made system of logic to mere intuitions of such a system, end quote. Marx. But Marx does speak in a few places of a, quote, application of dialectics. For instance, when he tried to interest the Chronicle, a newspaper with an interest in German scholarship, in a review of Capital by touting it as the, quote, first attempt at applying the dialectic method to political economy, end quote. See Marx's letter to Engels dated November 7, 1867. These remarks always refer only in general terms to a positive connection with the, quote, dialectical method without any further precision. End footnote. Footnote. In a sense, Hegelo-Marxist approaches repeat the split Engels made in Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy, between Hegel's philosophy as a revolutionary method and as a conservative system. End footnote. Footnote. Indeed, Marx's texts contain a number of analogies to Hegelian logic that have been extensively exploited in the Hegelo-Marxist literature. Parentheses, see, for example, Kroll, 1971, Brinkmann, 1975, Stoppelfeld, 1979. Instead of immediately inferring a, quote, application from the existence of such analogies, one ought first to examine their function within the text more closely. In this context, the work of Schrader, I think it's Fred Schrader, is illuminating. In his analysis of the Grundrisse, the argumentation of which appears to be most strongly shaped by Hegel, he also took into account Marx's economic sources and found that, precisely in those passages that seemingly align with Hegelian logic, Marx relies on Sismondi, Storch, and Say, not only regarding economic facts, but also in terms of terminology and even conceptual framework. See Schrader, 1980. End footnote. Footnote 18. Teunissen himself did not undertake this. The understanding of Marx's method outlined in Teunissen, 1975, was based on different premises. End footnote. Footnote 19. In the 7th chapter, regarding the missing transition from money to capital, it will become evident that this, quote, concealment, end quote, can indeed be highly problematic. End footnote. Footnote. An example from the field of crisis theory is discussed in the 8th chapter. End footnote. Footnote 21. This conceptual development is frequently referred to as, quote, logical development, as opposed to historical development. However, it should be noted that, quote, logical is not used here in the sense of formal or mathematical logic. Footnote. On Hegelian dialectics is a, quote, movement of the concept, end quote, based on a, quote, metaphysics of the concept, end quote, see Fulda, 1978, and footnote. Footnote. At a general level, dialectics is characterized in much the same way in Hegel. For instance, in section 81 of the Encyclopedia, quote, the dialectical moment is the self-sublation of such finite determinations, bracket, of the understanding, Michael Heinrich, in bracket, and their transition into their opposites. Dialectics is this immanent transcending, The dialectical elements therefore constitute the moving soul of scientific progression, and is the principle through which alone immanent connection and necessity enter the content of the sciences, end quote. Hegel. However, such analogies do not contribute much to an understanding of Marx's exposition. The, quote, immanent transcending, end quote, must be demonstrable within the categories themselves. In Marx's work, these categories do not simply originate from another field, but, insofar as they organize external material, are of a fundamentally different nature than the categories of Hegelian logic, which refer only to themselves. End footnote. Footnote, for example, regarding John Stuart Mill, it is stated, quote, as alien as the Hegelian, quote, contradiction, the source of all dialectics, is to him, he is just at home with banal contradictions, end quote. Marx. The context makes it clear that by the latter, Marx means formal logical contradictions. In the notes on Wagner, Marx explicitly rejects the insinuation that he had conceived the relationship between use value and exchange value in capital as a logical contradiction. Kosiba in 1979 demonstrated that, quote, contradictions in Marx's work fulfill widely varying functions of exposition and carry different meanings. End footnote. And check out the piece by Kosiba on this channel. He wrote the entry for Alfred Schmidt in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory. End footnote. Footnote 25. Marx was already aware, as early as the Grundrisse, of the danger that his dialectical development might be reduced to a mere movement of concepts. Where, regarding the transition from exchange value to money, he noted, quote, it will be necessary later, before breaking off this inquiry, to correct the idealistic manner of presentation, which creates the appearance that we are dealing merely with definitions of concepts and the dialectic of these concepts. End quote. Marx. Apparently, however, Marx had not yet succeeded sufficiently in making this correction in the first edition of Capital, for in the afterword to the second edition he had to admit, quote, the method employed in Capital has been little understood, end quote. Marx. And the charge against which he had to defend himself was that of Hegelianism. Marx then explains how the appearance of an a priori movement of concepts could arise in his well-known remark on the difference between the method of inquiry and the method of presentation. Quote, inquiry has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyze its various forms of development and to trace out their interconnection. Only after this work is done can the actual movement be adequately described. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is ideally reflected as in a mirror, then it may appear as if we had before us a mere a priori construction. End quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote 26. The critique of political economy certainly shares this critical intention, the dissolution of the appearance of the, quote, independence of something immediate that is initially presupposed with Hegelian philosophy. I think I read that weird. The critique of political economy certainly shares this critical intention, the dissolution of the appearance of the, quote, independence of something immediate that is initially presupposed with Hegelian philosophy. End footnote. Footnote. Riedel concludes here that it was only at this point that it became clear to Marx that the, quote, logic immanent in the dialectical presentation is not adequate to the, quote, specific logic of historical processes, end quote. A realization that led not only to the abandonment of the project, but also led to a crisis in Marx's understanding of method and a certain turning away from dialectics. While it is certainly correct that one cannot assume Marx's understanding of method remained unchanged after 1857, the point at which Riedel identifies a crisis in this understanding does not seem very convincing to me, for Marx appears to have been clear about the limits of dialectical exposition, at least on a general level, already in the Grundrisse. What becomes problematic for Marx in the text is the specific formulation of the dialectical transition to capital, a point Riedel convincingly demonstrates. However, this does not call into question dialectical development as such. End footnote. Footnote 28. This can usually be demonstrated by looking at the context in which the respective outlines are formulated. A detailed interpretation of the evolution of the structural plan within the Grundrisse, however, must be omitted here. End footnote. Footnote. It should be noted that, quote, capital in general appears twice as the title of the first section and as point 3, or the third chapter of that section. End footnote. Footnote 30. For discussions of this, quote, plan change problem, end quote, see among others Vygotsky, 1967 and 1976, Rozdalsky, 1968, Volume 1, Schwartz, 1974, 1978, Mueller, 1978, Jan Nietzold, 1978, Tarnowski/Cheparenko, 1987, and Jan, 1992. I have a piece on this channel by Cheparenko on, I think it's VP Shkredov, who's an important influence, who had a lot of similar insights to the New Marx reading, but in the in Moscow. Very interesting person. VP Skretov was also influential in Paresh Chattopadhyay and his analysis of capitalism in the Soviet Union. My own position can be found in Heinrich, 1986. I think I have that piece on this channel. A version of this essay, which appeared in Capital and Class in 1989, sparked a heated debate there. See the rejoinders by Burkett, 1991, and Mosley, 1995. And footnote. Footnote. It is therefore hardly convincing to make this concept a linchpin of the interpretation, as is done by P.E.M. 1975, P.E.M. 1978, and Bischoff/Otto, 1984. And footnote. Footnote 32. That is, a rent that is not paid, like differential rent, for the superior quality of the soil, but rather is paid exclusively for the use of the land as such. And footnote. Footnote 33. It now seems clear that the section Capital and Profit was written before the theories on surplus value, contrary to the arrangement indications in the Mega. See Omura, 1984, and Mueller and Foucault, 1984. However, this is immaterial to the problem discussed here. And footnote. Footnote. The Mega editors now also assume that the draft plans did not originate in January 1863, as is long supposed, but rather in December 1862. This would clearly place them before the letter to Kugelmann. And footnote. Footnote. The dispute often revolved merely around which parts of capital fell under the section of quote, capital in general, and which did not, and whether the distinction between capital in general and competition might perhaps still be, is overlaid by, and this is a kind of a fucked up translation, is overlaid by other classification criteria. The most detailed study from this perspective comes from Winfried Schwarz, 1978, and footnote. Footnotes 36. Emphasizing this point is not a matter of pitting stage theory approaches against general theories, but rather of noting their theoretical difference and the nature of Marx's own work, which is precisely not a stage theory. Perhaps the sharpest conceptual distinction was drawn by Kozo Uno, who differentiated between the quote, pure theory of capitalism, intended to elucidate the functioning of capitalism as such, and a theory of the quote, stages of capitalist development, which had to take into account historical changing economic institutions and patterns of policy, and finally the empirical investigation of a specific capitalist system in a given country. Uno criticized Marx for failing to clarify the distinction between the pure theory of capitalism and its liberal stage of development. Quote, he took it for granted that an increasingly pure form of capitalist society would emerge with the development of capitalism. End quote. Kozo Uno. Regarding Uno, who is little known in the German-speaking world but was one of the most significant Japanese Marxists, see McLean, 1980, and Sakin, 1984. Ito, 1988, provided an account of Marxian theory that was significantly influenced by Uno. End footnote. Footnote 37. At a general level, such a circularity was already addressed in the second edition of this chapter during the discussion of, quote, dialectical development, end quote. End footnote. Footnote 38, therefore, it is not possible to relate the exposition of Marx's Capital to the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics familiar from economics, as for instance Godelier, 1966, does, despite all due caution. And footnote. Footnote 39. Summarizing, Marx writes regarding the first volume, quote, what we were dealing with was the immediate production process itself, which presents itself at every point as the process of an individual capital, unquote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote 40, quote, every individual capital is a concentration, greater or smaller, of means of production with corresponding command over a larger or smaller army of workers, ... The growth of social capital takes place through the growth of many individual capitals, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote 41. Regarding the exposition in the second volume, Marx writes, quote, however, in both the first and second section, The concern was always only with an individual capital, with the movement of an autonomous part of the social capital, end quote. Marx. And that's the end of chapter 5 of Michael Heinrich's The Science of Value. Thank you so much for listening.